All right. Welcome to the Saving Stormwater podcast. I've got a great guest for everybody today, but before we do that, I just want to introduce the people who make this podcast possible. So if you've ever had any trouble keeping everybody on the same page when it comes to stormwater, or maybe you've asked for something to get done and it didn't get done in the right amount of time, if any of these kind of situations apply to you, then you're not alone. Compliance Go was made to address the miscommunication that can sometimes be the difference between a fine or a shutdown order. With Compliance Go, your teams can be prepared for every stormwater part of the NPDES permit. If you already have a stormwater compliance software, you might be able to save some money by switching to Compliance Go. Their pricing starts at $20 a month, and you can get started with one site free for life at the link in the podcast description. Also, one more point of business before we get into our podcast today. We do have a few exclusives on our YouTube channel, so check out our Stormwater Go YouTube page. That's Stormwater Go. We've got a couple exclusives on there. I think my favorite is the Tara Rost podcast episode. We did that back in early 2019. It's one of my favorites. She's an amazing stormwater professional. Talked a lot about, women in the water industry. Just a great episode. So make sure to go check that out as well. All right. Today I have Jason Dorney with me on the podcast. He brings a new kind of a perspective that I don't think I've ever had before. So welcome to the show, Jason.
Thank you very much, Preston. I really appreciate it. I'm really happy to be here. Looking forward to it.
Thanks. Yeah. So I'm looking forward to it as well. Kind of the way I see it, you've been able to see stormwater from both sides of the coin, both public and private. But tell our audience a little bit about your job experience and how you've been saving stormwater.
Thanks. So right now I'm working with a company called Core Erosion Control Services, and we're a manufacturer of compost filter socks and switchgrass filter socks. We're based out of Vienna, Ohio, which is up near Youngstown, if you're not super familiar with Ohio. We service the eastern United States, mostly in the mid-Atlantic region. We have a very strong presence in the greater Philadelphia market, the whole Pennsylvania market, Ohio, West Virginia, and we're growing day to day. I have in the past been a stormwater inspector. I've recently worked for an engineering firm, writing SWIPs, conducting stormwater inspections, weekly pre-post rain inspections, things like that, as well as conducting SWIP audits, acting as a third-party inspector, kind of keeping an eye on the inspectors that were hired by a contractor. And this was done for larger projects or in the realm of a large institution that had a lot of projects, many projects going on at once. So they had multiple subcontractors, and each subcontractor would hire its own SWIP writer and then SWIP inspector, and then we would be hired to come in and plan check the SWIPs as well as conduct biweekly audits on their job sites. So I've been in the industry since 2006, and I've seen a lot of change. And unfortunately, in some manners, I've seen a lot of things that haven't changed.
So what's changed over time? 2006, I definitely was not running around in the stormwater game.
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest changes is that people have taken it more seriously. It has definitely become a much more of a concern both with the public and amongst the regulatory community. And that's trickled down to the construction of, be it homes or commercial construction or even infrastructure projects. Not just on the erosion and sediment control side, but also on the post-construction stormwater side, where you see bigger basins or more sophisticated types of basin, whether they're everything from the small rain garden up to a big biofiltration basin, tree trenches, uh, any sort of these post-construction BMPs that are really helping to reduce the pollutants that are being discharged by stormwater in a post-construction manner. And of course, new BMPs come out all the time for temporary construction and for post-construction, but I'm mostly involved in the construction BMPs, the temporary construction BMPs. The compost filter sock being one that's fairly new, but even now they have the stage release silt fences, all kinds of different blankets and turf reinforcement mattings, things like that. And we've come a long way from using hay bales and straw.
Thought just kind of occurred to me. So there was the Deepwater Horizon spill that was in 2010, and then there's only a few massive kind of discharges that I can think of immediately. Do you think those type of big public kind of, I don't want to say catastrophes, but almost kind of catastrophes that get a lot of publicity, do you think that has anything to do with a little bit more attention that's been focused on stormwater since 2006?
I don't think that those big catastrophes really have much to do with stormwater. I think what is driving this home is just a lot of the ever increasing costs and things, what it costs to treat water. If you're pulling your drinking water from, let's just say, Lake Erie, and you've got harmful algal blooms, and I believe it was the city of Toledo last year or the year before, or maybe a few years at this point, that couldn't use their water. You couldn't even boil it because there was so much algae in it, and it was harmful. When something like that happens, people take a step back and say, why is this happening? And It's because of the stormwater runoff, and it was mainly excessive nutrients getting into the water from construction, but also from a lot of agriculture, a lot of that northwestern Ohio that drains into there, and I think parts of Illinois, and all of that sediment and the nutrients and the pollutants that it carries getting into those water bodies, and then having something like that, which I think you could consider a catastrophe. Certainly not.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Maybe not on the scale of the Horizon Deepwater, but things like that, things like the Chesapeake Bay, where you used to be able to pull bushel and bushel and bushel of clams and the famous blue claw crab, and now those things are few and far between. And while some may argue we've overfished a lot, but a lot of that has to do with sediment getting into the water and these algal blooms, and it's across the board in our country. There's a huge dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, and it's mainly because of sediment and nutrients getting into the water via stormwater. I think we've done a pretty good job at controlling the point sources at wastewater treatment plants, factories, industrial sources, but we're still trying to get that non-point source really controlled.
Right, and that really is the $1 million question. When I think about stormwater, it's very rare that I even think about an immediate point source anymore, because I honestly think if your average Joe saw somebody just with a massive oil barrel and was just dumping something into the road, I'm pretty sure they would say something. It's, the sweeping dirt into a drain, or maybe, throwing cigarette into a drain or something like that I think is a little bit less common knowledge.
Yeah, for certain. And as our cities and our infrastructure ages, and we continue to grow, our suburbs grow, things like that, our populations grow, we're just stressing our infrastructure to the point where we can't handle it. And that's also a huge reason on kind of the post-construction side, where you see cities really struggling with having those combined sewers still, where
Mm-hmm.
every time it rains, essentially they're pumping raw sewage and things like that out in these combined sewer overflows, and it's going into our creeks and streams. And they're trying to figure out how to handle that. And so you've got these stormwater fees. And of course, anytime a city proposes a stormwater fee, you get people saying, oh, you want to tax the rain. This is government overreach. But
Mm-hmm.
really, it's for a purpose, and it's to try to mitigate some of these things and either separate out the storm pipe from the sanitary sewer pipe, or
Mm-hmm.
reduce the amount of stormwater that's going into the pipe so that we can handle these big storms. And even these
Sure.
little storms, I mean, if you get consistent little storms back to back to back, that's also a big problem for these systems. So
Mm-hmm.
I think it's those types of things that have really increased people's awareness. And I do believe that there's just an overall trend towards environmentalism and kind of cleaning up the mistakes of the past, if you will. And
Yeah.
water, it's we all need it, right?
Sure.
Clean water is a huge part of everybody's life, and unfortunately, sometimes people don't think about it until it's a little too late. But I think those are the
Yeah.
things that have pushed stormwater uh, into the place that it is right now.
Yeah, and that's good. Yeah, more attention to stormwater is absolutely a good thing for everybody. So, you mentioned something briefly there about, people's ability to, like, not being able to boil algae. And I think you mentioned something about budgets. Um, it reminded me about a conversation we had off air about, one of the best ways to address stormwater is to plan for it beforehand.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from a post-construction standpoint, that's obvious. You have to engineer these BMPs and things like that. What typically I think tends to happen during construction is that people aren't planning for it. People aren't putting their BMPs in place. People are trying to uh, roll the dice, if you will, to see what they can and can't get away with. Are they going to have some regulator come in and give them a fine? Do they know, oh, yeah, I know that I can kind of play fast and loose with my BMPs not being in, and then somebody's going to come and, oh, they'll slap me on the wrist and say, no, 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 you got to put your BMPs in, and then I'll put them in, rather
Mm-hmm.
than just being proactive and upfront and putting them in and maintaining compliance throughout the life of the job. And I will say that, from the point where when I started to today, that is less and less frequent. You do not see that as much, but it still happens.
Yeah.
But you know, when you get involved with contractors that do plan for it, and they have a good project manager, and they have a good inspector, and there's open lines of communication, a lot of those, budgetary issues and things like that, the planning, that all gets hashed out right in the very beginning, and you do plan for it, and you say, all right, well, if it's going to rain on Thursday, we better get our BMPs in on Wednesday, because we don't want to try to scramble last minute to get, some silt fence put in, or some compost filter sock put in, or to spray with a hydro mulch, knowing that we need, 12 or 24 hours for it to set.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and well, I like what you were saying about, like, there's a little bit of vaguity. I'm showing my lack of education here. The permit's written intentionally with a bit of open to interpretation-ness. I guess it's Friday. I don't need to be able to speak smart today. But there's an intentional direction that the EPA has taken to make sure that states can implement a certain amount of, I guess, personality that their state can kind of inject into the permit when it comes to their regulations. And I think, to be fair to a lot of people, there's just, they read something and it's like, well, what does that mean? Like there's a section of the NPDES permit that talks about you're required to give you're required to give everybody the extent of training that's applicable to their job sphere. And it's like, well, does that mean I just tell them, make sure no dirt goes down here? Like that's intentionally vague. And so some states have really good education backgrounds where other states don't necessarily have a lot of education information or even resources for, let's say a construction team to educate their group on stormwater.
Yeah, I think it really does run the gamut, and the NEPDES permit there is an umbrella permit, and then obviously the states can be much more strict, and depending on which state you're in, you're going to get either we're just going to go with what the NPDES permit says, and we'll just add a little bit here and there, or you're going to get states, particularly like California, that's going to say no, we're going to go very strict. We're going to have sampling requirements and very specific certifications for people who can conduct inspections, or certifications for people who can write SWIPs. So it does run the gamut, and the interpretation that the permits can be left open to is always something that I think can get a little bit hairy on job sites, because the people that are reading the permit and the people that are enforcing the permit usually have two different interpretations. Mm-hmm. And the interpretation is not, we'll say, the contractor's interpretation, it's the regulator's interpretation. Right. That's the interpretation that matters. And you can be in a state like California, for example, that has just multiple different climates and geographies, deserts, coastal, mountain, valleys, and that interpretation is necessary, right? Because you can't regulate an area in the desert like you're going to regulate an area in Northern California that sees 20, 30 inches of rain on average, where in the desert mm-hmm. they might see 5. Right. Just totally different climates. So it can be a challenge, but that's why good communication is always necessary. And I think that a lot of regulatory agencies get kind of a bad rap most of the time. Mm-hmm. People think they're just out to kind of wag their fingers and fine people, but it's been my experience that the people who work for those regulatory agencies, they care about the environment, but they also want to help educate people, and they want to make it easy for, we'll say, contractors, builders, the construction industry in general to comply with the permits. And they're more than willing to help, but you have to ask them for that help, or you have to ask right. them for their interpretation. That's typically where I've seen the best results, is where everybody's upfront with expectations and interpretations. Mm-hmm.
That's a good point. I wanted to bring up with you. That's one of the most common problems that, we hear from people on the podcast, off the podcast, who tell us, that's just this problem where I've got this regulator who's telling me I just need to do this, or, you've got the regulator who's saying, look, man, I just need them to clean up their drains, or I just need them to do this. And the way I see it is that everybody's kind of competing against everybody at the same time. And I don't think it needs to be that way. It seems like everyone's just got, I don't know, is it different interests, or I don't know. Have you seen any strategies that have worked for keeping everybody connected?
Yeah, communication is the biggest thing. And you're right. I mean, there are certainly competing interests, right? A contractor or a builder wants to get the job done as fast as they can, with the highest quality they can, with the least amount of money that they can spend, right? And they want to make the most profit. regulators don't necessarily care about profit or the time it takes to complete a job. What they care about is that you're in compliance with the regulations that they're enforcing. So you have to find a way to meet in the middle. And if you're communicating, if you have, a good project manager, you've got a good inspector, and you've got a reasonable regulator, and everybody's talking to each other, then that one will set the tone at a good pre-construction meeting. You have that meeting, everybody meets, shakes hands. Although I guess nowadays, you might not be shaking hands with
they bump
anybody.
elbows, yeah.
But you get together, you go over the expectations, say, all right, we're gonna build this project in 3 phases. Phase 1, we're doing this. Phase 2, we're doing this. And you ask the regulators for their input, and the inspectors go out, be it weekly or pre-storm, post-storm, during storm, and talk with a project manager and say, look, you've got a big problem up here in the northwest corner. You got this slope. It's not stabilized. We got to get it stabilized. That's what you need to focus on right now. And they do that, and they show the effort. I think that everybody can coexist very happily on projects. But again, it's all about communication, like most things in life.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. That's really good advice. Does that happen frequently, infrequently? Is it just because you've kind of been on both sides of the coin? Have you seen it happen often? Would you like it to happen more often? I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I think yeah, everybody would like to see it happen more often, but it is happening more and more these days. And as you'll hear about fines, certain industries will get fined. A home builder might get a multi-million-dollar fine. That always gets people's attention. Or a utility project might get a big fine. I think that most days now, it's more often than not, you have people that are at the very least willing to talk and listen to somebody else. This isn't a new thing. It's not like maybe 1999 where in some states state permits were just coming out. It's been around for a long time now.
Right.
If you get a contractor that says, oh, I didn't know I had to do that, that's just, in my opinion, somebody who's kind of playing, again, fast and loose, because all of these regulations have been in place for a long time now. Most professionals have heard of them and have had to implement them. So it's been my experience that certainly as time goes on, more and more folks are willing to have that communication. They recognize the importance of it, and they recognize the importance of being proactive with their BMP installation and maintenance, with walking a job site with your inspector. If you have an inspector come out once a week and the project manager doesn't know their name, has never seen their face, and has never walked a job site with them, they're going to put a report in the SWIP book, and that project manager, one, is probably never going to read it, and two, isn't probably going to implement any of it. And that is just a recipe for disaster, because one day something is going to happen on that job site, and everybody's going to point fingers. And the project manager said, well, we hired that company to do our inspections. Why didn't you tell me about this? The inspector is going to say, I've called you and you never want to walk with me. This is on my report. It's been a carryover item for 6 weeks and nobody's ever done anything about it. You don't even read the reports, and you get a bunch of finger pointing, and that doesn't solve the problem. And, in some cases you can end up in court, and then it gets really nasty, and nobody wants that.
Yeah, well, definitely not. And I think for the most part, communication really does help to mitigate that and help everybody avoid court.
Yeah, I think only the lawyers are happy when that happens.
Yeah, and let's not make the lawyers happy, right?
Right.
So I think we should switch gears a little bit here. Talk a little bit about inspections. So from what I am gathering from you, you've done quite a bit of inspections. Do you think that inspections actually do improve the quality of stormwater over time? Do you think they help more than they hinder? I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I have done a lot of inspections, and certainly I believe that they help the quality of stormwater without a doubt. The reality of it is that a project manager, CM, whatever, superintendent, whatever the person's title and their role is, generally their role is not that of someone conducting a stormwater inspection to ensure compliance with your state permit or the EPA permit wherever you are and whatever permit you have. Their job is to build a building or construct a pipeline, construct a road. That's their job. When an inspector comes on the site, their job is to look at your site through the lens of compliance with that permit. And they're going to look at your job site much differently than the PM or this CM would look at it. And they're going to walk the job site and they're going to look at things that not only maybe look okay today, but you can say, all right, well, if it's supposed to rain next week and we're going to have thunderstorms, this is going to be a problem spot. So we need to be proactive and we need to fix this before it becomes a problem. There's the obvious thing of you just need to stabilize, right? Stabilization, erosion control is the number one thing to prevent erosion is erosion control. But you also have to have your sediment controls up in case you do get some erosion. And those are the obvious things. The not so obvious things are, hey, this silt fence is put in backwards. So if we get a big rain event, it's going to undercut the silt fence, and we're going to have all kinds of mud in the street, in the creek, whatever. And taking that critical, if you will, specialized look at a job site is incredibly important in maintaining compliance and then also helping to improve the quality of stormwater, because it's not just the stormwater, right? It's the receiving waters as well. So you can improve the quality of the stormwater, and in so doing, you're also improving the quality of the receiving water. And here in Pennsylvania, we've got the Delaware River, but we've got a lot of creeks and streams that get to the Delaware River or the Susquehanna, right? Or, any major river in the state. They all start somewhere, and a lot of them have these tributaries that are getting clogged up with sediment or debris from construction sites that frankly could be fairly easily avoided if you take that critical look and you are proactive and you do install and maintain your BMPs properly. And this may sound a little jaded or cynical, but I think the only people who think it's a hindrance are the people who are paying for it. And I don't think that they think it's a hindrance to water quality. I think they think it's a hindrance to their profit. Right. And that, I understand that may be something of a broad brush stroke, but a lot of people appreciate clean water. A lot of people appreciate being able to hunt and being able to fish and being able to recreate and swim in water that's not polluted. I mean, not a lot of people surf in Pennsylvania, right?
No, they don't.
We go down the shore and you go down to the beaches in New Jersey and people surf down there. Well, you shouldn't surf after it rains. Out in California, a lot of surfers, right? They tell you every time it rains, they tell you stay out of the water for 24 to 48 hours because of all the pollutants that the stormwater is carrying in there. Now, it's not just the stormwater, then that becomes the receiving water. The ocean then is affected by what the stormwater brings. And that's what our industry is trying to prevent, not just during construction, but in the post-construction as well, keeping those pollutants out of those waters so that people can recreate in them safely, so that, we're not getting 2-headed fish and 3-headed turtles.
I mean, I would kind of like to see a three-headed turtle, but not not at the expense of our water quality.
Yeah, I mean that's great for a traveling amusement show, but
Sure.
not when your little kid is playing in the creek out in the backyard.
Right, right. So, Cal, I feel like I say this every episode. We've only gotten through like half of the questions I wanted to ask, but we are starting to come up on our 30 minutes here. Before we get into anything before we get into anything else, I did want to ask. So, if you guys are following our Stormwater Go page on LinkedIn, we periodically post some updates about our podcast, or just ask questions about what you would like to hear from us on the podcast. This last week, we asked you guys what questions you would like to have from our guest today, and Clayton Hall from Robert Kistner asks, do you see an increased or decreased focus on stormwater in the future, and why?
Yeah, and I think that I certainly see an increased focus on it for a lot of the reasons that we've already discussed. But our population is growing. Our cities, especially, have problems with infrastructure, and keeping stormwater and this is from the post-construction standpoint, keeping stormwater or reducing the flow and the time that the stormwater takes to get to the combined sewer systems is incredibly important, and that is going to help to alleviate some of the infrastructure shortfalls that we find ourselves in. From a
Mhm.
construction standpoint, absolutely. Soil is incredibly important to not just the health of our ecosystem, but to our existence. And keeping the soil out of the water and out of creeks and streams is very important. And that soil carries a lot of pollutants, whether they be heavy metals, chemicals, nutrients, and keeping those things out of the water is also incredibly important. And one big way you can do that is just by keeping the soil out of the water. And so I think there's been a huge focus put not just on storm water, but just overall water quality. For far too long in this country, we've had this strange relationship with water, uh, be it paving over creeks, putting them underground so that we can build on top of them, or just building all of our industry on a river and spewing toxic chemicals into the rivers with any with a little regard for what's going to happen to them. And the fact of the matter is that someone always lives downstream. Your
Mhm.
your pollutants don't go away just because they go in the water. They just go downstream. And it seems like for a long time we didn't think about that. And we also didn't realize that most people are downstream of someone else who uh, may have the same notion that they just put it in there and it goes down the water and it's not their problem anymore. And we're finding now, especially now, we have a lot of old legacy industrial sites where the cleanup and abatement of this long-term pollution is reaching into the tens, hundreds of millions, even $1 billion. And that's just something that I don't think we want to deal with in the future. And people are stepping up and saying, look, we got to put a stop to this. And focusing on stormwater, because that is the major way that a lot of these pollutants get into these waters, is a great place to start. I think it's the Cuyahoga River caught fire, and that's what
Yeah,
prompted the formation of the EPA. I read that and I said, that's amazing. And then I read that that wasn't the first time that happened. That was like the 12th time that the Cuyahoga River caught on fire.
really.
Yeah, and you think about that, like that's amazing that one, it took that many times for that to happen to have someone take action. And so I just think that um, also, I think, it sounds kind of negative, everything that I'm saying, but I also think that people have seen the vast improvements in air quality and water quality and just overall environmental quality that have we've achieved over the last, say, 40, 50 years. And people are starting to say, yeah, hey, we can get to swimmable, fishable, drinkable. We can get there, but we really need to ratchet down and attack the problem from every angle. And stormwater is the biggest contributor to pollutants in waterways.
Mm-hmm.
So I only see an increased focus in it. Now there may be some places regionally where there's not much of a focus on it at all, but overall across the board, I think you're going to see more of an increased focus.
Right. One thing I wanted to add to that question is, do you see, or is there any adjustments in terms of stormwater focus that you can foresee due to COVID? I mean, it's no secret that it's changing a lot of industries. That there's a lot of places that are having to make pretty rapid and massive changes to, if it's a private business, maybe it's their business plan, or if it's a public institution, maybe they're having to make massive changes to their budget. I don't know. Do you see any adjustments having to be made due to COVID?
Yeah, I think that probably the biggest adjustments right now are just in having people on site. So your inspections, if you're conducting weekly inspections and you're the inspector and you walk with the site superintendent, well, now there may be some hesitation to do that. Sure, people are going to wear masks and all of that and try to socially distance as much as they can, but that I hope that doesn't cause that disconnect that we had discussed earlier, where you get an inspector just walking by themselves, and then you get a project manager who doesn't read the reports or really interact with them in any way. I think it's going to change the way people communicate, which is always, can be a good thing, where you may have that situation where the inspector walks by themselves, but then they send, other than putting the report in the SWIP book, then they send the report electronically to the PM and say, hey, here's the report. I just wanted to point out these 3 things are potential problems that I see. This is probably your highest priority. You want to get this thing fixed right away. And aside from the paper trail being created in the SWIP document, then that also has a paper trail of communications, which I always think is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
But, aside from maybe the fear that the COVID can spread through water, I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of long-term impacts to the industry.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be more in the people gathering and people being in close proximity to one another that's going to change. It may make projects, what might have been a 6-month project now may be an 8-month project, because you can't bring on every subcontractor all at once and have, a bunch of people working on the job site at once. You may have to kind of stagger them a little more than you would have previously.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, that's about all that we have time for. Thanks for sitting down with me. I really appreciate it, Jason.
Oh, thank you very much, Preston. I really enjoyed it, and I'm happy to do it, and I'm happy to be back anytime you want.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I'd love to have you on again. Like I was saying, guys, we only scratched the surface here. I think we only got through maybe a third of the questions that I wanted to get through and that I had for Jason. You've really got a handle on the situation, man. So if I can just pay you that compliment.
Thank you.
Before we go, is there anything that you want to leave our listeners with?
No, I think just really communication. Get your BMPs in and maintain them, and just keep that open communication.
Couldn't agree more. All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening to the Saving Stormwater podcast. Make sure to check out some of our other episodes. Last time we sat down, I got to sit and talk with Dan Nedvedek about the ever-changing landscape of stormwater compliance after COVID. Also, make sure to check out Compliance Go for their inspection software. They can handle a lot of the communication that happens in between all the people we've talked about today. So they'll definitely be a great resource during the social distancing times. All right, have a good one. And remember, we all live downstream.